Hello, I'm Paul Carroll and welcome to this digital photo video tutorial on creating a high dynamic range or HDR image. In this tutorial I'm going to be using Photomatix Pro software to generate a HDR image using 3 files shot at different exposures but of exactly the same location. Here is the final HDR image that I'm going to produce. You can see that it displays a full range of tones, including shadow detail in the foreground here around these rocks, as well as highlight detail up in the sky. If I flip over into Photoshop for a minute, you can see the 3 different exposures that my final HDR image has been composed from. The first image has been exposed correctly for the foreground, and as a result the midtones are very light and the highlights of the sky are completely burnt out. The second exposure renders good detail and nice colours in the middle ground, but the foreground is too dark and the sky is still burnt out. Our third and final exposure is for the sky, and you can see some detail is being brought through in the clouds and there's nice blues up in the sky. But this exposure results in a complete loss of detail in the foreground and the middle ground being a little bit too dark. Each of these exposures therefore will bring something through to the final HDR image that we're going to produce in Photomatix Pro. So if I go back into Photomatix, I can close down my final image and we can get started. If when you first launch the Photomatix Pro software, the Workflow Shortcuts dialog box isn't visible, then you can activate it by going up to the Window menu and down to Workflow Shortcuts. With this now activated, simply click on the Generate HDR Image button to start the process, and this will open the Selecting Source Images dialog box. It's from here that you'll select the 3 start images. So click on the Browse button and navigate on your computer to wherever you've got the 3 start images saved. Holding down the Control key and using your mouse button, you can click on each of the images and that will select all 3 of them, and then go down to the Open command, click Open, and you can see that it's loaded the 3 start images into our Selecting Source dialog box. Now you just need to click OK, and the Photomatix software will open this Generate HDR Options dialog box. In here, the only options that we need to worry about are these ones at the top. Ensure that the Align Source Images box is checked, and the radio button for Correct for Translation and Rotation is also checked. Leaving all the other options either greyed out or to their default settings, go down and click OK. Photomatix will now convert each of the raw files and generate our initial HDR image. Now this could take a few minutes, so what I'll do is I'll leave you here and I'll join you again once it's complete. Hello again. This dark and rather disappointing result is the image that Photomatix has initially generated. At this stage, the high dynamic range isn't visible. This is because the screen cannot represent the tones in the image properly without further processing, and this further processing is called tone mapping. So the next stage is to go down to the tone mapping button, click this and we'll launch the settings dialog box, and you'll immediately see that the generated image looks a little more pleasing with a greater degree of visible tones. The degree to which you apply tone mapping adjustments is very dependent on the image itself and the look that you're trying to achieve. Using the strength and light smoothing options in conjunction with each other, some very striking hyper-real effects can be produced. With this image, however, I'm going to try and produce a more subtle effect. To do this, I'll start by adjusting the sliders and settings under the Details Enhancer tab. Light smoothing controls the extent to which the luminance variance between dark and light pixels is smoothed. Setting it too low will create that hyper-real effect, which can also produce grainy images with obvious haloing. The higher light smoothing is set, the more natural the blend and the overall feel of the picture. High or very high works best on most images, and here I'm going to set it to very high, which is the final button on the scale. The strength slider controls the level of contrast applied across the image. Moving the slider to the top of the scale produces a very contrasty image. But the lower that the slider is set, you can see if I drop it down here, the less contrast which is applied across the image and the slightly flatter that the result looks. I'm looking for a more subtle effect, but something that still has a little bit of contrast, so I'm going to set it around the middle area, and something like 59 looks about right for this image. The luminosity slider controls how much shadow detail is resolved. So the higher the slider is set, the greater the detail in the darker areas of the image. Setting it to +10 therefore resolves the greatest amount of detail. But as I'm attempting a more natural look, I'm going to set it to somewhere around +4. There we are, I think that looks nice. Photoshop users can leave the colour saturation slider to the default, as Photoshop allows a greater degree of control over saturation. However, if you're not planning to make any final tweaks to this image later, you may want to adjust the colour saturation at this stage. However, I'm going to leave it at its default setting of 46. Underneath the image histogram, there are 4 additional tabs that offer further control, and we're going to go through them each one by one. We'll start with the Tone tab, which sets the white and black point in the same way as you'd be familiar with the levels control in Photoshop, setting the 2 points on the image histogram scale that visible tones start and stop. When adjusting these sliders, pay close attention to the histogram graph, ensuring all the tones remain within the histogram scale. So you can see, if we set the white point too high, we begin to lose all the detail in the highlights in the sky. In the same way, if we set the black point too high, you can see that the dark areas in the foreground are becoming burnt out. For this image therefore, I'm going to set my white point to around 3% and my black point to around 0.5% or 0.6%, and that gives me good detail in both the shadows and the highlights area, and you can see the visible tones in my image are all well within the histogram scale. Now we're going to move on to the Colour tab. The first slider, Temperature, controls the colour temperature or white balance of the image. And as I'm happy with the white balance effect of this image, I'm not going to be making any adjustments to this slider. The Saturation Highlights and Saturation Shadow sliders do exactly what they say on the tin, allowing some striking results to be produced by boosting saturation in certain elements of an image. So you can see here, if I pump up the slider for the Saturation Highlights, but really reduce the Saturation Shadow slider, some really striking effects can be produced, with a monochrome effect here in the shadowy foreground, and a very colour saturated effect in the sky and middle ground. For my image, however, I'm going to be applying a more of a subtle effect, so I'm going to go for about +5 on the Saturation Highlights and about +3 on the Shadow Saturation, and that's giving a bit more of a balanced saturated effect. The next tab, Micro, has 2 sliders, Micro Contrast and Micro Smoothing. Micro Contrast controls the intensity of the contrast across the image, so setting it into negative values produces rather flat looking results. For a more punchy effect, if we take it up high into the positive values, you can see that that's having a more of a dramatic effect across the image. For the effect that I'm looking to achieve, I'm going to put it to about +7. There we go, that looks about right. The Micro Smoothing slider controls the radius of the pixels that this micro contrast is applied to. So by setting it to the higher end of the scale, you get a more blended, subtle look. By reducing the amount of smoothing applied, putting it at the lower end of the scale, you get more of a vivid and punchy effect. For this image, I'm going to set it around the midpoint, something like 15. That'll look about right with the amount of micro contrasting that I've applied. The final tab is the SH control. This controls how much smoothing is applied to the shadow and the highlight areas. You can see if I increase the smoothing highlights right to the top end of the scale, 100%, I've completely lost detail in some of these highlights in the sky. Keeping a close eye on the image histogram, I'm going to knock back the highlight smoothing so that I'm retaining some detail in the sky but also brightening it at the same time. And around 30, I think that'll be right. You can see there that I've still got some space on the right hand side of the histogram, and that means that my highlights aren't burnt out. Shadow smoothing and shadows clipping control the level of shadow detail. Although I'm happy with the detail in the foreground here, so I'm going to leave both of these sliders to 0. If you wanted to, increasing the shadows clipping to the top end of the scale would really bring some dark areas into those shadows. And then the shadow smoothing slider would control how that contrast within the shadows is smoothed out. So you can see raising that up to the top end of the scale would bring back some of that detail into the shadow areas. But as I've said, I was happy with the shadow detail as it was, so I'm going to leave those sliders back down at 0. So with all the adjustments made, I'm happy with the overall look of my final image. So now I just need to go down to the process button and click there with my mouse, which will allow Photomatix to generate the HDR image. Now this will take a few minutes again, so I'll see you on the other side. And there it is, my final processed HDR image. All that needs to be done now is to save this file off on my computer. So if I go up to the File menu and down to Save As, I can choose somewhere on my computer to save the final file to. Give it a file name, I'll leave it as Birchin123. I'll change the file type to a 16-bit TIFF. This will give me the greatest amount of bit depth, allowing greater control later on if I want to make further adjustments in, say, Photoshop. There we are then. I really hope you've enjoyed this technique. Make sure you give it a go yourself using the start images on the CD and familiarise yourself with Photomatix Pro and its adjustment sliders. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.